Sarah Miller blended into the Saturday morning crowd at the downtown farmers market perfectly. That was entirely by design. At 34, with her chestnut hair pulled up into a frayed, messy bun, wearing a thick, oversized wool cardigan and faded denim, she looked exactly like what she wanted to be, a quiet, unremarkable civilian running weekend errands. She carried a canvas tote bag filled with organic apples and a loaf of fresh sourdough. No one bumping shoulders with her would ever suspect that beneath her baggy clothes were the subtle, faded scars of shrapnel. Nor would they guess that for the better part of a decade, she had been a highly classified Tier 1 trauma surgeon, embedded with elite special mission units, pulling shattered operators back from the brink of death in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the globe. Today, her biggest tactical decision was supposed to be choosing between clover or wildflower honey. She handed a crumpled $10 bill to the vendor, an elderly woman with kind, crinkled eyes. "Beautiful day for it, isn't it, sweetheart?" The vendor smiled, bagging the heavy glass jar. "It really is," Sarah replied softly. Her voice was gentle, lacking any trace of the authoritative steel that used to echo through the blood-slicked belly of medevac helicopters. Then, the peaceful morning shattered. It started with the sound, a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of locked rubber tires dragging across asphalt, followed by the deep, guttural roar of a heavy engine revving completely out of control. Sarah's body instantly tensed, her peripheral vision snapping toward the busy avenue adjacent to the market stalls. A large commercial delivery box truck, moving far beyond the speed limit, violently swerved to avoid a sedan running a red light. The immense weight of the truck fought against the driver's sudden correction. The truck lost. The heavy vehicle jumped the concrete curb with a thunderous crack, plowing effortlessly through the wrought iron decorative fencing. It careened directly into the heart of the crowded market. The impact was deafening, a horrifying symphony of snapping wood, shattering glass, crushing metal, and the sickening heavy thud of a multi-ton machine obliterating everything in its path. The truck slammed into a cluster of produce and floral stalls, barely 40 feet from where Sarah stood, burying its front axle deep into the wreckage before finally hissing to a violent halt. For one agonizing microsecond, the world hung in absolute, stunned silence. Then, the screaming began. It was the chaotic, high-pitched wail of pure civilian terror. The crowd fractured into absolute panic. Dozens of people scattered blindly, knocking over tables and trampling dropped groceries. Others froze completely, their nervous systems short-circuiting in the face of sudden, violent trauma. A few instinctively raised their smartphones, creating a sick perimeter of digital voyeurs, filming the nightmare but offering no aid. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't run. Her resting heart rate, usually a calm 60 beats per minute, barely fluttered. The world around her instantly slowed down, the chaotic, deafening noise filtering out to leave only the cold, hard, tactical data her brain had been permanently rewired to process. Threat assessment. Truck immobilized, engine smoking but off, no secondary threats visible. Casualty assessment. She scanned the wreckage, her eyes sweeping the devastation until they locked onto the epicenter. Beneath the crumpled, jagged metal of a destroyed canopy, a young man was trapped. He looked like a college student, maybe 20 years old, wearing a university sweatshirt. He'd been thrown backwards, his lower half pinned beneath the twisted wreckage of the truck's steel bumper and the splintered market stall. He wasn't screaming. He was staring up to the bright morning sky with wide, unseeing, terrified eyes. But it wasn't his silence that triggered Sarah's internal alarms. It was the color. A rapid, rhythmic surge of bright, oxygen-rich crimson was soaking through the torn fabric of his jeans, cascading over the splintered wood and pooling aggressively onto the cobblestones. It was pulsing outward with every single beat of his heart. The unmistakable, terrifying signature of a massive arterial bleed. A compromised femoral artery. In a healthy adult male, a severed femoral artery meant exsanguination, bleeding to death, in roughly 2 to 3 minutes. "Somebody call 911, a business suit man shrieked, waving his arms helplessly. "He's dying! Someone do something!" Nobody moved forward. The paralyzing grip of the bystander effect held the crowd captive. They were terrified. They were waiting for sirens. They were waiting for the professionals. Sarah looked at the young man's rapidly paling face. The nearest ambulance was at least 10 minutes away in Saturday downtown traffic. He had 90 seconds left. The glass jar of artisanal honey slipped from Sarah's relaxed fingers. It hit the cobblestones, shattering into a dozen pieces, the sweet liquid mixing with the dust of the ruined street. The quiet, unassuming civilian vanished. The veteran woke up. The sound of the shattering honey jar was the starting gun. Sarah moved. She didn't run with the frantic, flailing scramble of a panicked civilian. She advanced with the ruthless, calculated efficiency of an operator stepping off the X. She cut through the chaotic mass of screaming shoppers, her eyes locked entirely on the dying young man beneath the twisted metal. A man in a polo shirt stepped blindly into her path, holding his phone up to record the carnage. "Out of the way!" Sarah roared. The voice that tore from her throat was unrecognizable from the soft-spoken woman buying apples seconds earlier. It was a command voice, forged under the deafening roar of medevac rotors and enemy mortar fire, a frequency that demanded instantaneous, unquestioning compliance. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, dropping his phone to the pavement. Sarah slid to her knees beside the trapped student. The cobblestones bit into her shins, but she didn't feel it. Up close, the tactical reality of the situation was horrifyingly clear. The truck's reinforced steel bumper had crushed the wooden market stall, pinning the young man's right leg just below the hip. "Hey, eyes on me," Sarah commanded. She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing his gaze away from the wreckage and up to her. His skin was already ashen, cold, and dangerously clammy, the textbook onset of hypovolemic shock. "Cold," the boy stammered, his pupils blown wide and swimming in terror. "I can't feel—" "My name is Sarah. I've got you. Stay with me," she said, her tone an iron anchor in the storm of his fading consciousness. Her hands flew to his wrist, checking his radial pulse. It was practically non-existent, a rapid, thready flutter that told her his heart was desperately pumping an emptying tank. She shifted her gaze down to the injury. The blood was no longer just pooling, it was jetting out in a rhythmic, terrifying sequence. Massive hemorrhage, femoral artery compromise. It was the first and most critical letter of the March trauma algorithm. If she didn't stop that leak immediately, nothing else mattered. In the far distance, over the screaming of the crowd, the faint, rising wail of sirens cut through the morning air. Paramedics were en route, but Sarah's mind instantly ran the grim, uncompromising math of combat triage. The sirens were at least a mile out, fighting through weekend downtown gridlock. They had maybe 8 to 10 minutes before they even got boots on the ground. The boy's brain would starve of oxygen in less than 2. Official help was a ghost. She was the only reality this kid had left. Without breaking eye contact with the fading student, Sarah reached for the worn canvas crossbody bag slung across her chest. Anyone else would assume it held a wallet, sunglasses, and keys, but Sarah's hands bypassed the main pouch, finding a hidden, heavy-duty zipper concealed along the reinforced bottom seam. She'd yanked it hard. A vacuum-sealed matte black nylon pouch dropped into her hand. It was a customized tactical blowout kit, an IFAK. She hadn't walked out her front door without one in 10 years. It was muscle memory, a phantom limb from a past life that she couldn't amputate. She bit down on the red nylon pull tab, ripping the thick plastic open with a sharp, violent tear. Out spilled the specialized tools of her trade: a combat application tourniquet, a CAT, rolls of Z-folded hemostatic gauze, pressure dressings, and a pair of matte black trauma shears. "Okay, kid, this is going to suck," Sarah muttered. She grabbed the shears and brutally sliced away the blood-soaked denim of his jeans to expose the wound channel. The reality of the situation immediately complicated her plan. The heavy steel of the truck's bumper was pressing down directly over his upper thigh. Standard protocol dictated placing the tourniquet high and tight above the wound, but the crushed metal was entirely blocking the necessary clearance. She couldn't loop the nylon band around the limb. The boy's head lolled violently to the side. His eyelids fluttered, rolling back into his skull. "Hey, look at me," Sarah shouted, tapping his cheek hard. He was crashing, fast. The tourniquet wasn't going to work from this angle, and he was seconds away from irreversible cardiac arrest. She had to bypass the exterior and pack the bleeding artery directly at the source. But doing so while he was pinned under hundreds of pounds of twisted metal required an impossible degree of leverage. She couldn't do it alone. She needed the very thing she usually avoided: other people. Sarah snapped her head up, her piercing gaze locking onto the circle of terrified, paralyzed bystanders surrounding them. The quiet civilian was gone. The Tier 1 trauma surgeon was in absolute command, and she was about to draft an army. The bystander effect is a psychological trap. When a crowd witnesses a sudden, catastrophic event, the collective assumption is always that someone else will intervene. Someone else is more qualified. Someone else will save the day. The result is a deadly, paralyzing inertia. Sarah knew exactly how to shatter it. You don't ask a crowd for help. You isolate individuals and strip away their option to do nothing. She locked her piercing gaze onto a large, broad-shouldered man in a heavy denim jacket who was staring at the blood, his mouth hanging open in shock. "You, in the denim jacket!" Sarah's voice cracked like a bullwhip across the chaotic square. The sheer authority in her tone made the man flinch. "Get over here, right now." The man blinked, his brain struggling to catch up, but his legs obeyed the undeniable alpha command. He stumbled forward, dropping a plastic bag of vegetables. "Get on your knees," Sarah ordered, not looking at him as her hands flew through her matte black trauma kit. "What's your name?" "Mark," he stammered, looking sick as he knelt in the pooling crimson. "Listen to me, Mark," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, intense frequency that cut straight through his panic. "This kid has seconds left. I have to pack the severed artery inside his leg to stop the bleeding. It is going to be the worst pain he has ever felt in his life. He is going to thrash, he is going to fight, and he is going to scream. If he kicks me away, he bleeds out and dies right here on the concrete. Do you understand?" Mark swallowed hard, his face pale, but he nodded. "I understand." "Pin his shoulders to the ground," Sarah commanded, her eyes burning with an intense, calculated fire. "Put your entire body weight on him. Do not let his torso move an inch. Go." Mark scrambled to the boy's head, placing his large hands firmly over the student's shoulders, bracing himself. Sarah's head snapped toward a young woman in jogging clothes who was aggressively dialing 911, tears streaming down her face. "You, in the gray hoodie, drop the phone. They're already coming. I need your hands." The woman froze, terrified, but the absolute certainty in her posture pulled her in like gravity. She dropped to her knees on the opposite side of the trapped student. "I need to slow the blood flow before I go in," Sarah instructed rapidly. "Place the heel of your hand right here." She pointed to the inguinal crease, the junction where the boy's thigh met his pelvis, high above the crushed metal. "Press down with all your body weight. Lock your elbows. You are acting as a human clamp. Do not let up until I tell you." The woman nodded frantically, placing her hands where Sarah indicated and leaning her weight into the boy's hip. The aggressive rhythmic pulsing of blood from the wound slowed by a fraction. It wasn't stopped, but the pressure bought Sarah a handful of priceless seconds. "Good. Hold that," Sarah said, her hands moving with the blinding speed and precision of a concert pianist. She ripped a long strip of Z-folded combat gauze from its vacuum-sealed packaging. This wasn't standard pharmacy cotton. It was military-grade hemostatic dressing, impregnated with kaolin, a specialized compound designed to artificially force human blood to clot upon contact. It was a lifesaver on the battlefield, but to apply it, a medic had to physically shove the gauze deep into the wound cavity, pressing it directly against the bleeding vessel. Sarah took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the horrific reality of the scene. The smells of diesel fuel, crushed produce, and the sharp metallic tang of copper filled the air. The sirens were louder now, wailing blocks away, but they were still too late. The boy's head lolled back against Mark's knees. His eyes were half open, glazed and unseeing. The thready pulse in his neck fluttered, paused, and fluttered again. He was at the absolute edge of the abyss. The human body can only lose so much volume before the heart simply has nothing left to pump, leading to total cardiovascular collapse. "Okay, kid, I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "Mark, hold him down. Do it now." Sarah wrapped the end of the chemical gauze around her index and middle fingers, braced her elbows, and prepared to plunge her hands directly into the agonizing wreckage of the boy's torn flesh to find the severed artery blindly. Suddenly, the boy's chest hitched in a violent, ragged gasp. His remaining pulse vanished under Sarah's fingertips. He was flatlining. The pulse vanished. The thready flutter beneath Sarah's fingertips went entirely still. The young man's head lolled backward, his body going terrifyingly slack against the cobblestones as his autonomic nervous system finally surrendered to the massive loss of blood volume. "No, you don't," Sarah snarled, her voice a low, gravelly command directed at death itself. "Not on my watch!" With his heart stopping, the timeline had just condensed from seconds to fractions of a heartbeat. She didn't have time to hesitate. She wrapped the end of the kaolin-impregnated combat gauze around her fingers and drove her hand directly into the deep void of the wound tract. She had to work entirely by feel, bypassing the crushed metal bumper and the torn fabric of his jeans. Her fingers navigated the slick, desperate anatomy of the injury, pushing past muscle and tissue until she felt the hard resistance of the severed femoral artery pressing against the femur bone. It was a tactical, brutal maneuver, one that required zero hesitation and absolute precision. "I have the source," she shouted, her eyes locked onto the boy's pale face. "Mark, brace him hard. When his nervous system registers this, he is going to buck." With her left hand pinching the severed vessel against the bone to manually halt the flow, Sarah used her right hand to rapidly feed the Z-folded hemostatic dressing into the cavity. Inch by inch, she packed the kaolin compound aggressively into the empty space, building a dense, unrelenting plug of material from the inside out. The kaolin compound would immediately trigger the body's natural clotting cascade, artificially sealing the vessel, but it required immense, sustained mechanical pressure to hold the line. Just as she forced the final yards of the 12-foot roll into the wound, the boy's primal survival reflexes violently misfired. Despite being unconscious and effectively pulseless, the sheer blinding trauma of the deep tissue packing sent a massive shockwave through his dying nervous system. His back arched off the pavement with terrifying sudden violence, a silent scream etched into his features. "Hold him down," Sarah roared over the gasps of the crowd. Mark grunted, his face turning red as he threw his entire upper body weight over the boy's chest, pinning him to the earth with everything he had. The woman in the gray hoodie sobbed openly, her arms shaking with exhaustion, but she didn't let up her desperate pressure on his hip. Sarah locked both of her elbows, interlaced her blood-stained fingers, and pushed her entire body weight directly down onto the packed gauze. Standard combat trauma protocol dictated 3 to 5 minutes of uninterrupted, agonizing direct pressure to ensure the chemical clot held. "Breathe, kid," she whispered, a bead of sweat tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't look up from the wound as she addressed her makeshift assistant. "Hoodie, 2 fingers, find his carotid artery, right under the jawline. Tell me what you feel." The young woman reached out with trembling, blood-smeared hands, pressing 2 fingers against the pale, cold skin of the boy's neck. The seconds dragged into a suffocating eternity. The entire farmer's market was eerily silent, the panicked crowd having formed a wide, breathless circle, watching this unknown woman fight the grim reaper bare-handed. The only sounds were the hissing of the truck's shattered radiator and the ragged breathing of the 3 people fighting for a stranger's life. "I feel it," the woman suddenly gasped, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't relax a single muscle. She just kept her elbows locked and the pressure absolute. The hemostatic agent was working. It had sealed the breach, keeping the remaining fluid inside his circulatory system, so his fading heart had something left to pump. But the war wasn't won. He was still pinned, still critical, and still on the absolute brink. Suddenly, the tense silence was ripped apart by the deafening blast of an emergency air horn. Red and blue strobe lights violently washed over the shattered produce stalls, reflecting off the crushed metal of the box truck. An advanced life support ambulance and a heavy rescue fire engine leaped the curb, their sirens cutting out with a sharp, aggressive chirp. Doors flew open. A team of heavily geared, adrenaline-fueled paramedics and firefighters hit the ground running, carrying oxygen tanks, jump bags, and the hydraulic jaws of life. They were bracing themselves for a chaotic, unsalvageable disaster zone full of screaming civilians and dying victims. Instead, the lead paramedic broke through the crowd, dropped his heavy gear, and froze completely dead in his tracks. The lead paramedic, A 15-year veteran named Ramirez had braced himself for a bloodbath. When the dispatch call reported a pedestrian pinned under a commercial truck with massive arterial bleeding, he expected to find a chaotic, unsalvageable nightmare. He expected screaming, flailing, and a civilian bleeding out on the asphalt while a panicked crowd watched helplessly. Instead, he found an eerily silent, perfectly stabilized trauma pocket. He saw a broad-shouldered man locking down the victim's torso. He saw a young woman maintaining proximal pressure on the hip, and in the center of the carnage, kneeling in a pool of blood, was a woman in a faded wool cardigan, her arms locked straight out, applying textbook mechanical pressure deep into a massive wound tract. Next to her knee lay the matte black torn wrapper of a military-grade IFAK and a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears. "What the hell?" Ramirez breathed, dropping his heavy jump bag and sliding to his knees opposite Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm a paramedic. We're taking over. Let go." "Negative," Sarah snapped, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. She didn't look up. Her elbows remained rigidly locked. "If I lift off before you have a pressure dressing staged and fluids ready to push, he dumps his remaining volume and dies right here." Ramirez blinked, completely thrown by the cold, authoritative precision of her vocabulary. He looked closer at the wound channel. She wasn't just holding a rag over a cut. She had performed a blind, deep-tissue wound packing, a brutal, high-level intervention rarely seen outside of an emergency room or an active war zone. "Who are you?" Ramirez asked, his hand scrambling to pull a trauma dressing and a fresh tourniquet from his bag. "Listen to me," Sarah snapped, ignoring his question. She shifted her intense gaze to him, delivering a rapid-fire, flawlessly structured MIST report, the gold standard of military medical handovers. Mechanism of injury: blunt force crush trauma from a multi-ton vehicle impact. Injuries found: pinned right lower extremity with a massive compromise of the right femoral artery. Symptoms: Class 4 hemorrhagic shock, initial presentation of a rapid, thready pulse that progressed to a transient flatline. Treatment given: improvised proximal pressure, followed by deep tissue packing of the wound cavity using 12 feet of kaolin-impregnated hemostatic gauze. I have maintained direct, locked elbow pressure for exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Ramirez just stared at her. The firefighters, moving in with heavy hydraulic spreaders to lift the truck, paused for a split second, hearing the unassuming woman in the oversized sweater rattle off a tactical trauma briefing better than most ER chief residents. "Vitals?" Ramirez choked out, his professional training kicking back into gear. Carotid pulse regained at roughly the 1 minute 30 mark, thready, tachycardic, but sustained. He needs a massive transfusion protocol and surgical intervention immediately. He has maybe 15 minutes of reserve. "We've got him," Ramirez said, his voice dropping an octave, laced with profound, sudden respect. "Fire is lifting the bumper on 3. I'm staging the tourniquet high and tight the second he's free. We're going to transition on my count." "Understood," Sarah nodded tightly. The heavy, whining crunch of the jaws of life echoed through the market as the firefighters wedged the hydraulic spreaders under the steel bumper. Slowly, agonizingly, the crushed metal groaned and lifted off the boy's trapped leg. "He's clear," a firefighter yelled. "Staging the cat," Ramirez announced, slipping the thick nylon band of the tourniquet around the boy's upper thigh, well above Sarah's hands. "Transitioning in 3, 2, 1, pull." Sarah instantly released her locked elbows, pulling her blood-soaked hands back as Ramirez rapidly wrenched the tourniquet's windlass tight, locking it into the clip. The hemostatic plug Sarah had built held perfectly. There was no fresh arterial spurt. She had stopped the dying process. The space was instantly swarmed. 2 more medics rushed in, sliding a backboard beneath the unconscious student, slapping ECG leads onto his chest, and drilling an intraosseous I/O line directly into his shin bone to push life-saving fluids. The chaotic, hyper-coordinated dance of emergency medical services took over the scene. Sarah was no longer needed. The hero had fulfilled her purpose. Slowly, she stood up. Her knees ached, and her hands were coated in the tacky, drying rust of the stranger's blood. The quiet civilian disguise was ruined, but the adrenaline of the operator was already beginning to fade, replaced by the deeply ingrained instinct to evade. She stepped backwards, melting away from the bright strobe lights of the ambulance and slipping seamlessly into the murmuring, shell-shocked crowd.
As they hoisted the stretcher, Ramirez looked up from the boy's stabilized leg to thank the mysterious woman, but the space where she had just been kneeling was completely empty. "Where did she go?" Ramirez asked, scanning the perimeter frantically. Before anyone could answer, a heavy hand clamped down on Ramirez's shoulder. It was a silver-haired police sergeant, his eyes fixed intently at the matte black IFAC wrapper lying on the blood-stained cobblestones.
"Load 'em up!" Ramirez's voice cracked with pure adrenaline as he slammed the heavy rear doors of the ALS ambulance. The massive diesel engine roared to life, the siren wailing a sharp, aggressive warning as the rig tore away from the curb, parting the stunned crowd of bystanders. Inside the back of the ambulance, the young college student was unconscious, intubated, and entirely stable. His heart was stubbornly pumping the life-saving fluids being pushed through his shin bone. Against every law of human anatomy and probability, he was going to live. Back at the shattered market stall, the dust was finally beginning to settle. Sergeant Thomas Davies, a silver-haired 20-year veteran of the city police department, knelt carefully on the blood-slicked cobblestones. The area looked like a war zone, a chaotic mix of crushed produce, splintered wood, and the chilling massive pool of crimson. Davies reached out and picked up the torn, matte black nylon wrapper of the discarded tactical blowout kit. He turned the heavy, waterproof material over in his calloused hands. Before he had worn the blue uniform, Davies had done 2 brutal tours in Fallujah as a Marine infantryman. He knew military gear intimately, but what he was holding wasn't standard-issue grunt equipment. This was bespoke, sterile, highly classified Tier 1 tactical kit, the kind of gear issued only to the ghosts of the special operations community. Attached to the Velcro backing of the empty IFAC pouch was a small, subdued, dirt-smudged patch. It didn't have a name. It bore only a blood type, O-positive, and a faded, cryptic call sign embroidered in subdued gray thread, Archangel Actual. Ramirez jogged over from the staging area, aggressively wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. "Sergeant, did you find her? I need her name for the incident report. What she just did? I've been working the streets for 15 years, man. I've never seen anything close to that. She blind-packed a severed femoral barehanded and held it perfectly under a crushed truck. She saved that kid's life when he was already gone." Davies didn't answer right away. He stared at the faded patch, his thumb gently tracing the embroidered letters. A quiet, profound reverence settled over his weathered-lined face. He knew exactly what kind of hell a person had to walk through to earn a call sign like that. "You're not going to find her, Ramirez," Davies finally said, his voice low and raspy. He carefully peeled the patch off the nylon wrapper and slipped it deep into his breast pocket. "And she's not going to be in your report." "Why not?" Ramirez asked, bewildered, throwing his hands up. "She's a damn hero. The mayor, the news, the family, they're all going to want to know who she is." "Because people like her don't exist on paper," the old Marine replied, standing up and looking out into the dense, milling crowd of the Saturday market. "That wasn't just a combat medic. That was a Tier 1 trauma surgeon, a shadow. She spent the best years of her life pulling our boys out of the worst hellholes on Earth, and she came home to disappear. Let her have her peace." 3 blocks away, the wail of the ambulance siren finally faded into the ambient, gentle noise of the city. Sarah Miller stood alone in the brightly lit tiled restroom of a quiet corner coffee shop. The water in the white porcelain sink ran hot, turning a pale, rusty pink as she aggressively scrubbed the last remnants of the morning's violent trauma from her hands and out from under her fingernails. Her breathing was finally slowing, settling back into its normal, steady rhythm of 60 beats per minute. The cold, hyper-focused operator who had taken command of the street was retreating, locking herself back away in the dark, silent corners of her mind. Sarah dried her hands on a rough paper towel, adjusted her oversized, slightly frayed wool cardigan, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. There was no trace of the warrior left. She just looked like a quiet, unremarkable woman who had dropped her groceries. She pushed open the heavy glass door of the cafe and stepped back out into the bright, sunlit morning. A gentle breeze rustled the green leaves of the oak trees lining the avenue. A young couple walked a golden retriever past her on the sidewalk, laughing at a joke. The world had already moved on, blissfully oblivious to the fact that an angel of the battlefield was walking quietly among them. She didn't want a medal. She didn't need applause or a viral video. The only reward she would ever need was the silent, absolute knowledge that somewhere across the city, a mother's son was taking another breath. Sarah put her clean hands deep into her cardigan, turned her face up towards the warmth of the sun, and simply walked home.